Thanks,
intelligence
Thanks.
failure, John? On anti-Semitism?
Chinese troop in Cuba.
So there's one thing I just want to address really quickly, which I think is really important. It goes to Kelly O's question about Sabrina and what she has been dealing with since Thursday. So I just want to just reiterate a little bit what John said, is that we're certainly here at the White House under this administration. We're committed to the freedom of the press, which is why we had the press conference last week. So just want to remind folks, that's why we had the press conference last week. And just to also just repeat what you just all heard from my colleague, we are certainly condemn any efforts of intimidation or harassment of a journalist or any journalist that is just trying to do their job. And so I just want to be very clear about that.
Discriminating against me for the past 9 months.
Stop. How is she discriminating?
No, she called on you. She just gave you a few questions. I just need a question in 9 months.
Just ask the question.
Please,
Go ahead,
allow
Alma.
me to
Kick
do
us
my
off.
job and ask my question. When you say that you are journalists are being discriminated against, I've been in this
If this
briefing room.
continues, we're going to end the press
I've been
briefing.
in this
If this
briefing room, I'm
continues,
trying to ask you
Stop.
one
you're
Simon,
being
question.
incredibly
Simon,
rude.
stop.
You're incredibly rude. You're being incredibly
No, but
rude.
you are
You're
doing
talking
this
over your
in
colleague.
press. You are not applying
You're
it in
talking.
this
You're
briefing
talking
room.
over your colleague.
I have a
I'm not talking
question
about the
that's
colleagues.
that I'd like to ask. When President Biden forgave the student debt, the administration booked a $400 billion cost that added to the deficit at the end of last fiscal year. How does the administration plan to look at this issue given the pending court decision? Will you book the deficit reduction in debt forgiveness, or will it stay in hopes of challenging the ruling?
So look, I'm not going to get ahead of the ruling, right? We are very confident that we are that the law is on our side here. And so certainly not going to get ahead of what is going to happen and what the Supreme Court is going to rule. We are confident in our legal authorities, as we've said over and over again. And as you all know, and I think I've said this before, that the Solicitor General made a compelling argument before the court. So we're certainly not going to get ahead of this decision. Look, when it comes to the deficit, this is a president, and he's shown this by his action on how much he takes lowering the deficit, decreasing the deficit, makes that a priority. We've seen that in a record number, $1.7 trillion in the first 2 years. That is something, because of what the president has put forward in his economic policies, he's been able to do that. And in the budget negotiation that you all covered and saw, one of the things that he made sure is that budget negotiation lowered the deficit by another $1 trillion. So this is something that the president certainly cares about. And certainly has taken action and moved forward with making sure that his economic policy does just that. Look, more broadly as it relates to the student loan, we've been very clear. We think it is certainly important as we're coming out of this pandemic, to give folks, and the pause is going to be lifted, as we all know, in August, to make sure that we give American families a little bit breathing room. That is what this does. And because of this, it is actually going to be able to put money back into the economy. If you think about people being able to buy a home now, if you think about people being able to actually do more with this burden that they've been carrying and they've had to deal with. So we think it's part of that economic policy agenda to make sure that we are not leaving anybody behind, but also building an economy that is important and that is also fiscally responsible at the same time.
Very briefly, Senator Manchin was here earlier today. Was there any engagement by the president or anyone else, senior staff, on Acting Secretary Sue's nomination? And has there been any determination of how long she could stay in that role, in the acting?
So as I've stated before, we believe that Julie Su is highly qualified to be Labor Secretary. As you know, she served as Deputy Secretary for 2 years, and now she's clearly Acting Secretary. And we are doing everything that we can in our power to make sure that she is successful in becoming the next Labor Secretary. And I think I've laid out actions that we have taken every day, even during the budget negotiation, to make those calls, to have conversations with senators on the Hill, and to get her through. I don't have anything to share ahead of that, but we continue to support a swift confirmation of her. I don't have a readout of a a conversation with Senator Manchin in the last couple of hours, but I can assure you that our team here, Office of Leg Affairs, and other members of the different offices here at the White House has certainly been all hands on deck in trying to make sure that we get her through. Gotcha.
Karine, to follow up on the press freedom issue that you touched on, can you give us a sense of the discussion between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi about that? What did they discuss, and what did President Biden say to him about not only press freedom but the other human rights issues that are so clear in India right now?
So as we've said many times, the president will never shy away on having those conversations with a world leader, a head of state, when it comes to human rights. He has done that throughout the past 2 years and through his career as a vice president, certainly as a senator. I'm not going to get into private conversations, but I think we have made ourselves very clear here on our view, and I'll just leave it there.
Did the president accept Prime Minister Modi's answer to Sabrina about the human rights issues and attacks on Muslims and others in his country?
You know, we were asked this question last week on Friday, and I think that is for the Prime Minister to answer, and for all you all to critique or write about it. I'm not going to discuss that from here. What I know is that we are committed. We are certainly committed to the freedom of the press, which is why we held a press conference last Thursday, which is why we thought it was important for you all to hear from both, not just from the president, but also from the Prime Minister, and for journalists to be able to ask a question.
Thanks, Karine. I wanted to ask you about this new Bidenomics messaging push. Can you just give me a sense first of, how did you guys coin that phrase, or why did you decide to go with that branding going forward?
You don't like Bidenomics?
No, I'm just asking. I'm curious.
I think it's pretty clever. It's pretty good. It makes good sense, Bidenomics, right? It kind of flows off the tongue really well. But in all seriousness, look, what you're going to hear from the president, I don't want to get ahead of him. I think we've kind of laid out a little bit of what we are thinking, or what we think the president's going to lay out, or what he is going to lay out. Certainly it's a vision, right? It's a vision about growing the economy from the middle out, the bottom up. You hear us say that over and over again, because we believe that trickle-down economics does not work. And we have seen that over and over and over again. And what we have seen, even before the pandemic, is we've seen Americans and American families being left behind. And so one of the things that the data, if you look at the data and what we've seen from what the president has been able to deliver in the last 2 years, is an economy that's getting back on its feet, an economy that's actually delivering for the American people. 13 million jobs, unemployment rate at under 4%. When you think about wages going up, when you think about inflation at its lowest by more than 50% than it was a year ago, that's because of the work that this president has done, and he's going to continue to focus on what we can do to lower cost for the American people. And so that is incredibly important. Look, it's going to be a cornerstone speech, as you've heard me say. It's going to be an opportunity to talk about the historic progress, right, as we're talking about implementing those historic pieces of legislation. And so all of those things go hand in hand. And we believe that that is the vision of the president, and hence Bidenomics.
Well, one of the reasons I asked is because, the latest CNN polling showed that just 34% of Americans approve of the president's handling of the economy. So is there a risk that this new branding could backfire? And are you confident that this new messaging push is going to change Americans' opinions of the president's handling of the
So
economy?
we believe our job is to continue to speak to the American people, to lay out what it is that the president is doing on behalf of American families. And that is important. And we have the data to prove it. We have the numbers to show that his economic policy has indeed worked. Look, I kind of talked about this moments ago. This has been a challenging time for Americans, right? You had the pandemic. We just had my colleague here talk about the war that Mr. Putin has started in Ukraine, and what that has done to inflation, not just here but around the world. So we know that the American people they're dealing with a lot. But what we believe is that we have done the work. And we have shown that inflation has indeed come down. It is still too high, and so the president's going to talk to that. He's going to speak to where the Americans people are. and he's going to make sure that we lay out what is it that we have been able to do in a historic fashion to deal with what the American people is currently dealing with. But look, 13 million jobs, again, when you think about how Americans feel better about their personal finances, that is important. When you think about wages are going up, when you think about the really good paying, millions of good paying jobs, that union jobs that his policies are going to create, all the things are really incredibly important. So the president's going to continue to speak to that. And that's what we believe that is our priority to do.
So you're confident that you could change the public's perception of the economy?
We're going to try, right? I think the president, when he has a moment, when he is at the podium most of the time, when he's speaking to the American people, he speaks to the economy. He speaks to lowering costs. He speaks to what matters to the American people. He talks about making sure that we give Americans a little bit more breathing room. He understands what it's like at the end of the month when families are sitting around their kitchen table talking about how they're going to pay costs. That's why insulin at $35 a month is so important, right, for the senior citizens. That's what came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's why energy, making sure we're lowering costs for energy is so important. That's what came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that's just one piece of that's just one historic piece of legislation that is now into law. So there are so many things that we have done we believe that the American people need to hear directly from us, and that's what you're going to continue to do. Let's not forget the Invest in America tour, right? This is we're about to launch the second part of that tour, where cabinet secretaries, you're going to see the principals are out there talking to the American people. So we believe it is important for us to do that, and that's what you're going to see. Okay, Steve.
Follow-up to Jeremy's question. Should we view Bidenomics as a response, answer to, or opposite of Reaganomics?
I mean, look, we believe Reaganomics doesn't work. We've been very clear. We believe that a trickle-down economy doesn't work. It has not worked. That's shown to be the case for decades now. And so what we have been very clear, you hear me say this all the time, building an economy from the middle out and bottom up. That's what we want to do. And every piece of historic legislation speaks to that, speaks to what the president wants to do, very loud and clear in a historic fashion. Some of them in a bipartisan way. We think about the infrastructure legislation, right, and what that has been able to do, bringing both sides together, making historic investments in our roads and our bridges. The president just talked about broadband this morning, historic investment in broadbands to communities that have been left behind when we talk about that. And so all of these things are important. And so he is, if you will, reimagining how we should build an economy, transforming how an economy should look like for the better, so that we, again, do not leave anybody behind. And it's not about just blue states. It's about blue states, red states, rural America, urban America. It's about everyone who he believes he is the president for.
I will just follow up. The historians view Ronald Reagan as a top 10 president in their own surveys. He left office with a better than 60% approval rating. It's argued, you don't have to agree, I'm sure the president doesn't, but many people believe that Ronald Reagan's record, his economic record, propelled the country to prosperity, Morning in America, late 1980s growth, propelling it for growth of the 1990s. What's your response to the
What I
idea
will
that...
say, and we've been very clear, trickle-down economics does not work. It just does not work. It gives hands out to special interests and big corporations. That's what we have seen. And that would increase the debt, and it has increased the debt. That is what we've seen in the last couple of decades. It outsources jobs and raises utility bills for families. That's why the president is making sure that we're bringing jobs back to the United States. Manufacturing jobs, 800,000 manufacturing jobs. We've seen manufacturers wanting to invest in this country. We have not seen that in a long time, right? And so that is incredibly important. Utility bills, I just talked about what the Inflation Reduction Act is going to do. All of those things is building an economy, transforming the way we see the economy in a different way. In a way, again, that is equal, that has equity at the center of it, and leaves no one behind. And the president is very proud of what he's been able to do in the last 2 years. We understand there's more work to do, and certainly we're going to do that. Go ahead, Mike.
The president has called the previous administration's policy of separating families who cross the border illegally immoral and a national shame. USA Today published a story today that details how the Justice Department is defending that policy in a series of lawsuits filed by separating families. So my question is Why is the administration going to such lengths to defend a policy that the president himself says is a moral and a national shame?
So look, the president repeatedly has said that Trump administration's family separation policy was abhorrent, it was unconscionable, and violated every norm of who we are as a nation. He's been very clear about that. He's repeated that, and that's why on the first day in office, he made sure to end the administration family separation policy. And what we've been able to do is we created a task force, as you know, where we've been able to reunite about 700 family members and also support families that were torn apart. And so we're continuing to do that work, and certainly that is not going to stop. Again, that's why we put together the task force, that's why we ended that very hateful policy. So when it comes to DOJ and what they're doing and how they're moving forward on the litigation, I'm just not going to comment from here, but our actions policy-wise in the last 2 years, making sure that we reunite families, we still have that task force going, making sure we're supporting those families that were torn apart, ending that policy, I think speaks for itself. I'm just not going to get into the Department of Justice and what they're doing. Okay.
Two questions on the Montana train derailment. How confident is the administration that it's not going to have a negative effect on Yellowstone?
So just a couple of things on that. So obviously this is something that we are monitoring, the train derailment that occurred in Montana on Saturday, so a couple of days ago. The preliminary water sampling conducted by the Montana Department of Environmental Quality and the EPA have not shown any risks to the public drinking water, which is obviously important to the community, to the state of Montana. EPA, Montana DEQ, and Montana Rail Links are actively monitoring water quality, and federal agencies, including the EPA and DOT, are coordinating with the governor's office and local officials to assist in the response. And obviously, as always, whenever something like this happens, the White House is ready and to offer any federal assistance. And certainly, we are in regular communications with government officials on the ground.
On the heels of this and East Palestine, is there anything more the president can do to prevent more of these from happening?
Well, I know the Department of Transportation certainly has been looking into this and evaluating these types of derailment. So I would certainly refer you to them, and I know that Secretary Buttigieg has taken this very seriously, as has the President. So we are doing everything that we can to address this issue of derailment across the country. But as it relates to Montana, as it relates to even East Palestine, that community, we certainly were all hands on deck in making sure that we provided what the community needed. And in this most recent situation, we are here to offer any federal assistance that the state of Montana might need. Okay, go ahead, John.
Thanks a lot, Karine. Over the weekend, Speaker McCarthy floated this idea of launching an impeachment inquiry targeting Attorney General Merrick Garland. And the focus here, according to the Speaker, would be Merrick Garland's weaponization of the DOJ. What's your reaction to that idea?
So as you've heard me say repeatedly over and over again at this podium, is that the President respects the Department of Justice independence. He respects the rule of law, and that is what you're going to see under this administration. So I'm not going to speak to anything that is related to that piece, but I will say more broadly. Look, we've been very clear. I just laid out. We talked about Bidenomics. I was just asked by one of your colleagues why the president is focusing on this, why he's having this conversation with the American people, why we have coined this term. That's because the president believes that we have a lot of work to do for the American people, that this is the priorities of the American people, making sure we continue to build on the success that we've seen the last 2 years, continue to lower costs, making sure that we're implementing those historic pieces of legislation. Clearly that is now law. The bipartisan infrastructure legislation, when you think about the CHIPS and Science Act, when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, all of these pieces of legislation that are now law, clearly, are incredibly important. And so that's what the president's going to talk about, investing in America. And it's unfortunate that congressional Republicans want to continue to focus on an issue that that's not their priority. They want us to move in a bipartisan way on everything that I just laid out. We saw that in November in the midterm election, and that's what they want to see. And we would welcome congressional Republicans to join us working on behalf of the American people, working on the priorities that they care about, working on lowering costs for American families across the country.
If the Republican-led House goes down this path, they have the numbers, if they wish to do so, to impeach the Attorney General. They don't have the numbers, however, just based upon the makeup of the Senate. Would you say, Karine, that this is a waste of time on the part of congressional Republicans?
What I will say is basically what I just laid out seconds ago, John. It's just this is not the main priority of American families. They want us to come together in a bipartisan way to work on the things that they truly care about. When it comes to the Dobbs decision, right? When it comes to reproductive rights and reproductive health care, when it comes to making sure that we are working and focusing on lowering costs for American people. That's what they want us to see. That's what they want us to come together in a bipartisan way to deliver, to build on the successes that this president has done in the last 2 years. Good.
Thank you, Karine. I've got 2 quick questions. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is on the border, and he is escalating his attacks against the Biden administration, who, in his words, he calls, quote, the critical link in an illegal transnational human smuggling syndicate. I'm wondering if the White House has any response to that kind of rhetoric.
Wait, say that one more time because I have not heard
Yes, ma'am.
his remarks.
The governor says that the White House, in his words, is the critical link in an illegal transnational human smuggling syndicate.
So I'm going to be careful because yes, he's the governor, but he's also a candidate. So I'm bound by the Hatch Act. So I'm going to be incredibly careful, and I'm not going to comment on campaign matters. What I can speak to is more broadly. And I will remind you that congressional Republicans just voted. Literally, they just voted a few weeks ago, a month ago, for the biggest border security cut in history, the biggest cut in history when it came to the Default on America Act. That's what that was. Part of that act was to cut border security, and that's what they voted on. And meanwhile, what this president has done, he has secured record funding for border security. He has record number of agents and officers securing our border and is implementing policies that have resulted in significant drop in unlawful border crossings since Title 42. That is what the president has done. And so, I'm, again, going to be very mindful in how I respond. But speaking more broadly, I would say the question is to not us, but it is to congressional Republicans and what they have done to make this situation even more difficult by cutting the budget for by voting to cut the budget for border security and not supporting this president and what he's been trying to do.
My second question, it's not unusual for presidents to invite members of their family to official White House functions, like the steak dinner last week. I'm curious, though, in light of some of the recent legal controversy, if the president communicated to members of his family not to conduct business on White House grounds. Can you tell us about any kinds of guardrails that are up?
So look, I'm going to be, again, very mindful because this is all connected to a case that the DOJ is currently overseeing, so I'm not going to comment on that specifically, but as you know, and we have laid out very early on in this administration, when it comes to ethics, when it comes to how we all kind of move about and how we respect clearly the government ethics here. This is an administration that has been incredibly transparent on that and has put some very strict rules. And so I can speak to that. I can speak to how the president has moved forward in making sure that the people who work for him and himself are held to kind of a strict course of action. But I'm not going to speak to anything that's related to the case. I'm going to
Think about guardrails for the president's family?
I'm just not going to speak to anything that's related to this case.
Do any guardrails exist?
I'm not going to speak to anything that is related to this case. As you stated, there are, we've had, when it comes to ethics, we take that very, very seriously here in this administration. Thank you, everyone.